now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tejal Lad's M3 presentation called Life Between Generations, a Housing Typology for Aging in Place. And we'd like to welcome our guest critics, Sydney Brown and Michele Gucciardi. Sorry about that, Michele. And her thesis advisor is Terry Peters. And the presentation will last about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a period of about 40 minutes for questions and comments. So I'll turn it over to you, Tejal. Sorry, milestone 4. Excuse me.
Oh, should I start it again?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, and thank you for being here today for my Milestone 4 presentation. Currently, my thesis is titled Life Between Generations, a Housing Typology for Aging in Place. This thesis will focus on improving the quality of life in a neighborhood while the inhabitants are aging in place. I've explored concepts of healthy aging through social proximities, walkability, and healthy housing that work cohesively and maintain an excellent balance for the future by implementing aging in place strategies in an urban context. Currently in this thesis, the development of Toronto's laneway housing initiative provides an excellent base to introduce the new housing typology or a hybrid design that accommodates and examines movement through space where aging individuals or families can become self-reliant longer. In this presentation, I will dissect the definition of health regarding aging populations and how this applies to architecture and Toronto's surge of aging individuals. The themes that I will address throughout this presentation are aging in place in Canada, health and independence, walkability and social inclusion, and laneway housing. The research questions for this thesis are, what are the most effective strategies in housing and public realm design that encourage healthy aging while aging in place? What are characteristics of healthy aging that encourage a higher quality of life in housing? How can an improvement in housing for Canada's aging population and initiative for aging in place be achieved with these findings? What age range and neighborhoods in Toronto will benefit from an intervention that encourages independence? Seniors are projected to have a greater population than children in Canada by 2026, a milestone in our country's history. According to all population projection scenarios, seniors are expected to comprise around a quarter of Canada's population by 2036, and the median age is still expected to rise to 45 years within the same time frame. In addition to living longer, the elderly population is also living healthier and are continuing to be socially active, physically and mentally active where they can. This thesis addresses the relationship between people and housing, analyze how living conditions reflect its users. Since 2007, the Public Health Agency of Canada, in partnership with the World Health Organization, has played a lead role in the development and promotion of the age-friendly communities initiative across Canada. Understanding this, the concern for senior housing shifts to a healthy housing model, one that is affordable and builds healthy density. There is a growing awareness and desire for healthy living through an improvement in building quality and community, ensuring a higher quality of life. In the Government of Canada's Action for Seniors report, there are several suggestions and courses of action for seniors. Even though not all the solutions are architectural ones, the notion of aging in place is clear and can be addressed in an architectural setting. The targeted age group in this thesis is the growing aging populations who have the desire to continue to remain independent and seek an alternative to condos, senior housing, and neighborhood relocation. The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered a global cooperation and shift in thinking about health. The definition of health is shifting toward the notion of mind, body, and spirit. In Toronto, healthy housing has not yet been defined. However, there are many concepts that contribute to help form this definition. Physical health is not the only aspect of what health may look like. Environmental psychology also plays a large influence on health. In a healthy home, socio-psychological are important metaphysical factors that affect healthy aging. Perceived health status, self-esteem, self-achievements, and leisure activities are factors that have a positive correlation with healthy aging, whereas depression and loneliness have a negative correlation. Understanding this, social inclusion is encouraged to ensure that healthy aging is achieved in housing and in a neighborhood. As a conclusion from previous milestones, housing needs to maintain a positive and safe environment for health and social activity growth. This thesis proposal investigates healthy architecture because the housing is social and therefore exercises movement within an aging community. It is healthy because it strengthens neighborhood bonds by mixing uses and building healthy density to create a more authentic neighborhood. In this thesis, the two key themes where architecture can influence healthy aging are walkable communities and social inclusion within a neighborhood. This creates life between buildings. More and more people are learning the value of walkability in cities. From a health perspective, walkability helps aging individuals to maintain control over their activity, encouraging independence while aging. When pedestrians feel safe, they are more likely to engage in their surroundings, and this is when strong community bonds begin to form. Mixing uses on a site creates more walkable amenities to help achieve a balanced lifestyle. Moreover, smaller blocks relate to human scale, enhancing a feeling of safety with notable boundaries. In this thesis, there are two theories that I will incorporate into the design proposal that increases the probability of neighborly interaction. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar examined the ratio between brain sizes and group sizes in non-human primates. Dunbar concluded that size, relative to the body of the neocortex, is the part of the brain associated with cognition and language, is linked to the size of a cohesive social group. This ratio limits how much complexity a social system can handle. Understanding the social capacity of humans is important when designing for interaction because it allows the design to reflect the limits of social activity. 150 represents an ideal network that will last long and cohere well. Furthermore, the tightest social circle for any individual consists of 5 people. In Young Cities for People, Gallup discusses a social field of vision. This observation is imperative when understanding the types of interaction that occur at specific distances to be able to predict the likelihood of social interaction between residents. It is natural for humans to desire the company of others. However, by identifying these distances, one can design to ensure that neighborhood interaction occurs. Gallup explains that genuine conversation is not possible until people are within 7 meters of each other. The shorter the distance in the range, the more detailed and articulated the conversation can be. In this case, social inclusion in a community that promotes independence can be controlled by the distances that set the dwellings, walkway, and gardens apart. Life between buildings occurs by having a close proximity to friends and acquaintances in addition to enjoyable amenity spaces where leisure activity and other individuals is encouraged. This increases walkability and social inclusion. Neighborhood is not a place, it's a state of mind. A neighborhood embodies the spirits of the people who occupy it, an interwoven series of diverse narratives that complement each other. Urban mobility directly relates to social mobility and seamlessly connects moments of everyday life. While following Canada's aging in place recommendations, it is possible for healthy communities to be built or densified while improving the quality of life without relocation. Toronto has an abundance of underused laneways that provide potential opportunities to add healthy density to a site and tackle Toronto's affordability crisis. The variety of laneway conditions look somewhat like this. The Laneway Suites program for secondary dwelling units was approved by the City of Toronto in June of 2018, and the new Garden Suites initiative has been introduced quite recently. Examining Toronto's 140 neighborhoods, there are some unique demographical and site conditions that fit this type of proposal. Some important variables include percentage of seniors, percentage of the working age group, percentage of seniors living alone, and affordability. This chart lists the relevant neighborhoods that apply to these variables. Casa Loma, Mount Pleasant West, and Cabbagetown South have all very high number of aging individuals that live alone with reasonably sized laneway conditions where an intervention might work. Laneway suites provide opportunities for Toronto's missing middle and can encourage aging in place by creating a new dwelling on the same property, one better suited for the phase of life of the elderly occupants. These underused laneway sites provide an excellent opportunity to rethink the entrances of laneway housing and to possibly create a different kind of neighborhood, one that links backyard dwellings with each other. In this scenario, aging individuals can transition to the backyard community where they have access to friends, activities, healthcare, leisure activities, all within walking distance. This design proposal reimagines backyard living. When nearing retirement age, the main house can be used by the family while the seniors move on to the next stage of life in the backyard community, better suited for aging. A possible incentive to selling a portion of their backyard to the city for this residential development that replaces the laneway is a guarantee to occupy a dwelling of their choice upon retirement age. This ensures a healthy retirement plan while aging in place because residents will strengthen their relationship with their neighbors. The remaining dwellings are available to be purchased to people looking to join the aging in place community. This diagram dissects the usefulness of typical living conditions occupied by aging populations. So the garage has the potential to be used for another purpose due to the diminishing need for vehicular transport while continuing to age. The secondary common area is much larger and has the potential to be a significant shared space between tenants. This space is also already connected to another exterior access point. The backyard is the age's primary connection to green space, however, is becoming increasingly unwillingly unused due to ongoing maintenance. On the upper floor, the living spaces start to become vacant as the residents become empty nesters. Even though this space is mostly unoccupied, it still requires maintenance. The master bedroom is the primary space occupier on the second floor. However, residents may be forced to relocate if this level cannot be accessed due to mobility. This housing is designed to be a family home. By transitioning to a new resilient dwelling, the residents are equipped to still remain independent for as long as they can as their mobility deteriorates. This graphic shows the possible living alternatives when an ager decides to retire from their family home. As we can see, seniors housing, long-term care homes, downsizing to a condo, moving to the country, moving in with adult children, moving to the cottage, a senior housing community, or moving to a cooperative, or remaining in the family home that's not suited to aging. Or a better alternative is an aging in place housing model. Understanding the phases of human life can provide a better understanding of how housing can be designed to better suit the needs of its occupants. By identifying priorities in a life cycle, one can argue that the aging population faces similar wants and needs to those new to the world. The core idea of this proposal allocates space to transition to a new part of life and exploring hobbies and activities while re-engaging with family and friends with the time granted post-retirement. Creating isolated housing solely for the aging populations allows them to grow in this space that they're familiar with now that they're free of life responsibilities. Relocation to a new dwelling in the same neighborhood allows the living conditions to be better suited for the needs of the elderly, such as walkability, barrier-free access, and opportunities to engage with the neighborhood through gardens and amenities. This concept of healthy laneway housing for aging populations provides a better alternative solution to other forms of downsizing or housing relocation due to aging. The size of an average condo in Toronto is 70 square meters, whereas a typical laneway suite ranges from 50 to 140 square meters. This alternative is not as healthy because it does not have direct access to green spaces, walkable amenities, or barrier-free access to the ground, which discourages independent living while aging. In any other case, agers would need to relocate to a new environment, build new connections, and relinquish opportunities to host large gatherings for family-oriented mindsets. So the selected site for the thesis is in the Cabbagetown South neighborhood and along Calgie Lane. Currently in this neighborhood, the individuals in the housing are elderly people that live alone. The existing laneway looks safe and already carries minor leisure activities such as walking and cycling. The selected site currently spans a length of 259 meters and a width of 35 meters, primarily occupying Calgie Lane and portions of Drovers and Callahan Lane. There are a total of 96 existing buildings on the site. Calgie Lane currently features a central neighborhood house that provides a variety of in-home services to seniors and individuals living with physical disabilities who require assistance in order to be able to continue to live independently in their homes. These services are carried out by personal support workers, registered nurses, and home support workers. Having this building currently breaking up the existing laneway creates an excellent opportunity to have multiple access points to a backyard development, especially somewhere in the middle of a long existing laneway. Here are some street perspectives of the site along the laneway, Ontario Street and Berkeley Street. This site is also fairly walkable to basic necessities. This annotated map shows the walking distance to the nearest grocery stores in the area from the central neighborhood house as a point of reference. To understand the current potential of the site, the following diagrams illustrate potential growth as per the existing zoning bylaws for laneway housing. Here we can see the maximum potential footprint if solely designing for laneway housing. This master plan shows the potential layout of a laneway housing community if following the City of Toronto's zoning bylaws for laneway suites. There are clear indicators of many areas where this proposal cannot work, as highlighted in dark blue. Due to the existing laneway, there are many restrictions on dwelling widths, which cannot accommodate accessibility. The layout also creates tight corners not suitable for walkability and a continuous facade with no connection to adjacent dwellings. There is also a limit on how many stories can be proposed due to the setback from the existing housing. However, this is not as important when considering mobility in the neighborhood. This imprint of what laneway dwellings could look like based on the current setbacks creates buildings, whereas the intent for healthy housing for aging should create neighborhood. Without the laneway itself, there would be better opportunities for dwelling configurations that will better suit a neighborhood that promotes healthy lifestyles and social inclusion. This design proposal is a healthy backyard village where aging populations can continue to grow post-retirement. This move to the backyard allows residents to remain in the neighborhood that they are comfortable and familiar with, but encourages a fresh perspective on life, one that promotes exploration and a healthy life between generations. This proposed master plan looks at adding density to the site using the Dunbar ratio while providing a safe and healthy environment to age using social fields of vision. The housing design proposal follows the average dimensions of a laneway house in Toronto and a one-story wheelchair accessible micro unit for people with less mobility, so that it may be possible to imagine this intervention in other laneway neighborhoods. As aging populations continue to grow older, this is an excellent strategy with the potential to be scaled up and adjusted to intervene with other potential laneway neighborhoods. A walkway replaces the existing laneway and connects the entrances of the modules. Because of this, there is greater flexibility in adjusting the location of the proposed modules to not disturb existing housing. The walkway also features amenities such as shared gardens, outdoor seating, and gathering spaces for potential moments of interaction to occur. The neighborhood house is also proposed a modified program, so underground parking for residents in the backyard dwelling who still have need for a vehicle, a secondary main entrance that faces the backyard community, and canopies to create an enclosure for potential local trades, markets, and activities. To maintain a similar commercial footprint, another space has been allocated for a shared amenity space. In this scenario, the ideal occupancy is achieved while adhering to strict visual connections of units in groups of 5 to ensure that the residents have an awareness of their neighbors and friends in case of an emergency. So these site sections depict the density that's being added to the site. Wherever possible, existing trees are maintained or relocated. Here we can see the break in facade with the central neighborhood house in the middle of the site. Some factors that influence the configuration of the backyard dwellings include setback from existing residential dwellings, existing trees, fire truck and ambulance access, access to daylight, entrances to the backyard community, and any other existing buildings. This master plan features a combination of 3 types of dwellings to add variety and choice to which module an ager would occupy. There are 57 dwellings in this master plan with a proposed occupancy of 86 persons. To create more access points in the neighborhood development, the backyard neighborhood development, the central existing neighborhood house has been modified to accommodate another access point. The existing laneway entrances also have been modified to accommodate a larger turning radius for fire trucks and ambulances in case of an emergency. This annotated site plan shows how the design proposal meets fire truck access requirements by introducing a new fire truck route into the backyard village as identified by signage and a wider turning radii. Because of this, the 45-meter radius from the fire truck route spans across all of the proposed buildings. So here I'm going to walk you through one of the residents of this development. Her name is Gladys. So Gladys wakes up, gets ready, and has her breakfast. She meets her friend who lives across the walkway. They check on their vertical gardens to see which fruits and vegetables are ready to eat. They then head to the grocery store together, which is about a 4-minute walk through the walkway. They return and head home, each making lunch for themselves. Gladys takes an afternoon nap. After her nap, Gladys picks up her grandkids from the school next door and brings them home. Gladys's son lives in the house behind her new home, so she stays there until her son and daughter-in-law return home from work. Gladys stays for dinner and then returns home through the backyard. So Gladys lives in Module 1. This is the university. This module is a barrier-free 1-story microunit for individuals who live alone and can be an alternative to long-term care homes or assisted living facilities. The laundry facilities are purposely removed so that the resident can turn to the community center or their neighbors for assistance, strengthening the community relationship. These modules are placed close to the entrances of the backyard village for ease of mobility. They are usually placed in pairs to create more meaningful connections between sister dwellings. They are also nestled between the 2-story modules to ensure that there's a watchful eye in case of an emergency. Next, we have Bob and Donna. Bob and Donna didn't know what to do when their kids finished university and moved out to start their own lives. When they discovered that their neighbors were interested in moving into a backyard community, they were immediately on board seeing an investment opportunity in the new home. They currently rent out their house on Berkeley Street to a young immigrant couple and now live in a 2-story dwelling behind their old house. They were happy that they could downsize yet remain in the same neighborhood as their good friends. Bob and Donna start their day by going for a run together around the neighborhood. They have breakfast and then FaceTime their daughter who lives in Montreal with her boyfriend. Donna spends the rest of the morning working on her sewing projects while Bob watches a soccer game on TV. After lunch, they head to the community center for their weekly game of badminton with their good friends and neighbors Mark and Cindy. After the game, Bob heads home to answer a few emails while Donna and Cindy head to the grocery store to pick up some items for the barbecue later. After returning, they start to prepare the sides while Bob and Mark fire up the grill. After a few beers, the couples head to bed. So module 2 and 3 are both 2-story dwellings with a barrier-free ground floor in the case that the occupants require future barrier-free access. The secondary entrance The main entrance faces the backyard walkway, and the secondary entrances faces smaller pockets of green spaces and shared intimate patios in the neighborhood. The sun study of the design proposal analyzes how much natural light enters the space between the backyard dwellings. With the 45-degree angular plane from the laneway dwellings, there is not much of a shadow affecting the existing buildings. And this is how one seen between the buildings look like at different times of the day. So in place of the existing laneway, the proposed walkway allows flexibility in the configuration of the modules and to create a walkable backyard village. Pillows of green spaces are weaved throughout the path, being mindful of the existing trees on the site. Site accessories placed on this walkway include benches, picnic tables, shared barbecues, community gardens, and bicycle storage. The moment of connection between the walkway and the neighborhood house is where most community activity occurs due to the canopies around the perimeter of the community house. The walkway spaces act as a stage for moments to occur in the village. The aging occupants have easy access to view the activity in the shared space and choose to observe or participate. The walkway itself encourages a healthy lifestyle by encouraging agers to come out and integrate themselves in the community. There is a perspective of entering the backyard village of agers. So the proposed walkway is constructed with climate tile for ease of maintenance and to accommodate drainage, hydro, and sanitary lines from the community house. This walkway can be seasonally heated to eliminate issues of snow storage in the winter months. This enlarged view of the walkway outlines the distances between opposite dwellings. Certain conditions allow for a shared barbecue area behind a grouping of dwellings and allocate spaces for vertical gardens and planters between dwelling groupings of 4. This allows residents to continue to care for a garden without having to maintain a lawn. To combat winter months, exterior floor lighting along the pathway will help illuminate dark spaces and provide a small imprint of these types of transportations that can travel through the walkway. Here's a perspective between the buildings and another. This phase of living is one of re-exploration and enjoying the best parts of life. However, the family-oriented housing that aging populations currently occupy do not align with the changing needs of agers. This backyard village proposal adds healthy density and enhances an existing neighborhood network of social inclusion, while the housing itself accommodates the changing mobility needs of aging individuals. The concept of backyard relocation follows Canada's Aging in Place initiatives while pursuing a healthy housing. Inevitably, seniors have a specific goal in mind. Once the duties of life have been completed, the focus is placed on increasing the quality of remaining life. This ideology should be how all living conditions are designed from the beginning. The backyard village strategy can begin to tackle this incoming global issue of a surge of aging populations by encouraging independence and flexibility in day-to-day activities. Understanding the needs of agers encourages housing that better suits the priorities in a life cycle that individuals are facing, promoting exploration and rediscovering identity in this transition to a new phase of life. Thank you.
Thanks, Tejal. And we'll start with any questions of clarification, perhaps from the guests first, if you've got any questions you'd like Tejal to answer, and then we can go into comments.
Sydney here. Thank you very much. Super interesting proposition. Just a couple of questions of clarification. Could you speak just briefly about the just clarify the relationship between these smaller buildings and the communal center? Is the communal center simply a place where service workers come from, or is there an exchange of active space within the central shared building that is part of the living experience for people who are living within the backyard dwellings?
Yeah, so the community center kind of acts as an extension of certain amenities that some dwellings might need to use that building for. It's also a place for, as its previous use, for healthcare practitioners or nurses or support workers who want to help or are there to help in the neighborhood. It's still a building that serves that function as well.
And second question, is there necessarily a relationship between the inhabitants of the backyard dwellings and the original houses, or that just something that may or may not exist or evolve?
There's not like immediate relationship. I think the idea of this is to kind of keep the backyard community as a neighborhood within itself. So that transition from that main house to the backyard occurs. There is still quite a bit of space between the new dwelling and the previous one. It's about 7.5 meters, just following zoning setbacks to make sure that there's enough light that comes back there. But right now it's just kind of remaining as grass or whatever it used to be. There could potentially be a relationship, but the focus was creating the space internally within the backyard.
Thank you.
And when it comes to the ownership, Tejal, what would be the threshold? Would the, you know, what was, I guess, the garage in the laneway be a piece of land that passes in terms of ownership, or would this still be kind of a piece of the original property?
So so the entire development doesn't fall within the existing property lines. Because of that, the space, if we were to follow that, then the spaces wouldn't be kind of healthy to age in. So it is kind of taking away the garages, the parking garages that are back there, and proposing an alternative use for the space.
Okay. And I guess, you know, in this particular block, you do have this central neighborhood house as an existing building, right? This model, if applied to a different block that does not have something similar, like what would be the, you know, what would be the alternative? Like, how would you deal with that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the things as I learned while kind of pursuing this thesis proposal is that a lot of these conditions were site specific. So even though I had some parameters in terms of the modules that I had designed and the widths and the distances between them, it is still very much fitting to whatever is currently there already. In some cases of, if I can go back to the slide. In some cases where the existing dwellings were pushing really far back into the development, it was harder to have to put a module there. So even though other sites may not have a building like this, I think there are still unique areas where there will be space to kind of give breathable room at the back. In this case, it was just super convenient that this building was here and I could use it to my advantage to create more more access into the back.
Thank you.
I have a question still, Tejal, about what if you've put a lot of trees in the laneway between the houses. What happens when somebody needs to get in, you know, with a ambulance to pick somebody up? Do they just carry them a certain way to the ambulance?
Yeah, so actually when looking into the requirements for a gurney based on laneway suites, the only requirement for that is that a gurney would have to get in between the spaces. So as per the proposed fire truck access, the ambulance could get to that point, and then from there, a gurney would have to access the dwelling itself, where the widths do leave enough space for that to happen.
So same thing with a fire truck. You're using there's a distance to a truck that a hose can go, and have you got a diagram that shows that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, here.
Maybe just explain the diagram. I'm not quite. So the circles are representing the.
Yeah, so the circles are the 45-meter radius from the fire truck route. So I've proposed 4 routes into the back of the development because currently if just putting a lot of the troubles with designing a laneway suite currently is that a fire truck can't access the back laneway dwelling because the laneway itself is not a fire truck route. So to kind of work around that, I proposed a way to kind of push further into the development so that we can get like safety access to a lot of these dwelling units at the back.
Tejal, can I ask you one more question while you have this drawing on the screen? Could you zoom in to one of the smaller clusters and just walk us through the different units that are fitted together and just sort of identify one piece to the next, to the next, to the next, and where they have independent interior space and where they have shared exterior space?
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a drawing that shows that a bit clearer. Is this clear to read?
Yes, that's great. Yes,
Okay.
can you?
Okay, so these two units here are the micro units. So these are 1 story. And so these units are usually placed closer to where you can get potential vehicular access. So there's not a lot of walking to get further into the backyard development. And then module 2 and module 3 are the same. So you can kind of see the shared walls between them. So they're grouped in clusters of 4 around, and then where possible. And then everywhere else is usually in clusters of 2, as mentioned by like these sister units. And then they follow a setback from the main dwelling to ensure that there's space between that. And that's kind of how the configuration came about.
And in the module in the upper right-hand corner, say, which is a series of different units linked together. Once you're looking at 1 and 2 story pieces, or sorry, 2 story pieces together, can you just explain where one unit starts and stops? It almost looks as though one of the units is almost 2 rooms opening to the exterior, to the vertical garden. So it'd be helpful just to hear you explain where one unit starts and stops, where they have shared interior or exterior space.
So they don't share, each module does not share interior spaces. They only share the patio, like the exterior spaces. So, oops. So for example, this is the ground floor of 1 module. So they're just together. And then this would be another one. But they share, for example, like a patio area at the back, and this grouping shares a barbecue space and also a patio area. But the modules themselves, they don't share spaces with their neighbor, interior spaces.
In the upper right-hand corner of the cluster that we're looking at, it appears that there are 2 rooms, maybe a small study room and a bathroom that open to the exterior, but not to the interior of a unit. Is that correct?
Oh, so this is 1 unit here. This is the same unit. This is the smaller micro unit that's meant for universal accessibility.
Yes.
So
I think Sydney is referencing the one that's on the north side of the path, like right at the upper right corner, right? Is that the one? Yes, there. Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
okay, so you're referencing like the exit out to the side here?
Yeah.
Is
So
that
I'm not sure.
just trying to understand which unit those 2 rooms are attached to.
They're attached to here, I think I'll show that in plan a little better. So this is the module you're talking about, right?
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Now that reads much more
Yeah,
clearly.
I probably
Thank
just
you.
didn't. Yeah, sorry, maybe the graphic wasn't clear enough,
The
but it
line
does
weight
open it.
is deceiving. Yes.
Yeah, this is the unit that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And sorry, then just to go back to the drawing we were just looking at, could you just point out the shared outdoor spaces that would be available to that cluster?
Yeah, so we have the vertical gardens that are between every clusters of 4. So those are available for those around that space. And then in some areas where it's possible, as mentioned before, the patio where the barbecue area is only kind of applies to where there is enough space backing on to the existing dwelling unit, because you didn't want to disturb that too much. And then there are picnic benches scattered around in some of the other grass clusters between the development.
Thank you.
What's your attitude about the space between the original houses and your new units? So the curvilinear pinkish space, it's a shared garden between the existing house, or how do you decide who gets to sit in that area?
Oh yeah. I guess that part was just kind of something that wasn't decided in this like final version. It seems like I just didn't want to disturb the existing backyard too much. So I tried to keep it as much to the center as possible, with keeping, enough space where it is breathable between the backyard dwelling units. But currently it's just left as is. Potentially it could be nice to see a relationship, perhaps like somebody living in the house over here could also access the barbecue and the patio spaces, and perhaps they're also friends. But the idea currently is to kind of keep it with this backyard community as they grow together. But there is, it's not like I would close off that opportunity. I think perhaps that could be an option as well.
Well, it's just showing inconsistently on the one side, on the bottom of the page, which I guess is the west side. Most of the green zone seems to belong to the houses, and the laneway houses seem to just have bedroom windows onto that. Whereas on the other side, there's living spaces and patio furniture beyond those walls. So that's where the question's coming from. It just seems to be a different approach from one side to the other. Was that intentional? Is it because you've got more space on one side, or?
You mean like more space on this side, in the inside?
Let me get the annotation tool. So here, right, you've got a patio, and here you've got a patio. So this particularly seems quite connected. And whereas on this side, you've really kind of the units turn their backs on the original houses.
Okay. Well, the reason for that is just because that these are the micro units, like the smaller accessible ones, and they don't have an opening to the back, just the way that I had designed them, because I wanted them to primarily use the front so that they can keep within the community. But the reason for this side having a little bit more open space is because those modules do open out at the back, or the back of that module.
Okay, well, it was more a question, I guess, about what's the relationship to the original housing, and how do they feel about sharing essentially their entire common space or their entire rear yard with these units. They're pretty close.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea because theoretically, I think the intent was to kind of guide a new transition to the back. So the people who do live in this backyard village used to live in the dwellings that currently are there. So technically is a space that they used to kind of occupy, and perhaps maybe they're renting it out, so they still own that space. It's still theirs. And perhaps maybe that could create a relationship between the two as well.
Well, it would be very interesting to have almost like a diagram in terms of almost like a phasing diagram, where you see how at some point, you take, I would imagine that this house, for example, the property line is somewhere there, right? So this is kind of like, the property, and if this was the existing laneway, and how you transition this, this piece, right, into this function, right? And how that would be related to all of the different properties, like because obviously in order for this to happen, you would have to have some kind of a plan of transitioning and how you sever the piece of land or your lot in order to create this other condition that's facing the laneway, right?
People should feel free to jump in with their comments. I think we're
okay. So I'll start with the comments. So thank you very much for inviting me. This is really, really exciting. I'm gonna go and feed off of my own personal history of architecture in Toronto. Perhaps it's incorrect, but I do remember. I believe it was in the early '90s when the Laneway House by Bridget Shim and Howard Safcliffe kind of came to be, right? And it was, in some ways, it was revolutionary. Coincidentally enough, not soon after that, there was also one done by Don Schmidt from Diamond & Schmidt. So the Laneway House was in some way like the laneway where no eyes could see. It was the place where a new kind of aesthetic and a new contemporary architectural kind of language started to evolve. At least this is the way, like, if I had to have a visitor from outside of Toronto come and give him the first moment of this revolution that we're underseeing in terms of architecture, I would take them to the Laneway House. And I remember having difficulty finding it, right? So one of the first things that I would say is that I find it very fascinating and interesting that this new typology of living, right, which is something that is necessary because yes, there's an aging population and there's going to be a need, and there's always this question that people already at my age start to ask. With my wife, we often say, what are we going to do when we get older? Are we going to be able to live in Toronto, or should we start looking for something outside of Toronto, right? And of course, if you're attached to the city, like this would provide a model that allows you to continue to be, but not just almost in a secondary, where it's like a secondary stage. Like this would create a really strong primary stage for you to live that moment of your life, filled with dignity, fun. I mean, I would want to live there already today when I was looking at the images that you've created and those animations. So I find it interesting that the laneway becomes again the fertile ground where you can come up with a new prototype and a new aesthetic. So I think that was really interesting. I did have questions regarding the ownership piece, and ultimately the idea of having the laneway expression needs to have a face, right? Because it's so like introverted in some ways, right? That it's you would be driving up Berkeley or Ontario Street. It would be very difficult to understand that this reality exists, right? So having the opportunity of bringing some of this out from the laneway and anchor itself on the street, I think would be very interesting. In this case, you had the central neighborhood house, but in a case where you don't have that, how could that be tackled? How could that be achieved? Because I think it would be important to have that connectivity with the street, like with the actual vehicular street, some sort of like a gateway. And then the next thing I would say is like it would be very interesting also to do a study of how this reality within this particular block would be able to connect, right, with other blocks nearby. And that I think would be also kind of a bit of an interesting study to do, because you're almost creating a secondary system, almost like very symbolic of Toronto as well, where you have your orthogonal roadways overlaid, onto the more natural ravine system, right? So this is almost like an artificial ravine system of small dwellings and architectures that live within that orthogonal system. So I think that it would be, it should not be limited just to within the block, but it would be interesting to see how it connects, on all sides of the this proposal. But ultimately, I mean, I'm really, I think it's a fabulous idea, and I think you did an amazing job in visually representing it and to make us understand how this could work. I think that last comment that I would make, it would be interesting to see also a third or a fourth type, right? In this case, it seems like you have three, which provides an amplitude of opportunities, but it would be interesting to see how this could even, go beyond the three prototypes. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll add a few comments then. To begin first by saying yes, thank you for inviting me to take a look at your work today. It's a great question. How is this stage or these stages of life accommodated within the city? And there are many things that you're looking at here that I think are really important questions for us when we think about the way that the city evolves and our place in the city evolves. And when I look at the scheme, I think that there are almost two ways that you can talk about the work. And the first is in terms of planning, and the second is in terms of architecture. And when we're looking at it in terms of planning, I think that you're making a really strong case for increased densification and a more integrated idea of the way that public and private space are shared within the city. That is really interesting and does make a great case for an increase in density within this type of city block arrangement. Where I think that this scheme could begin to be stretched further is perhaps by thinking about it more specifically in terms of architecture. And as you begin to look more closely at each of the units and the clusters, to start to think in a more particular way about what in each one of these modular configurations actually does make it a place for aging, a place that is more adaptable to a different range of abilities or a different sense of independence. And so as you begin to look at a finer grain within each one of the units, I think that specific considerations about independence and interdependence become very important, as well as your sort of fundamental premise that these spaces are barrier-free, sort of on the level of sort of barrier-free access, kind of simple things like making sure you have a barrier-free front door, or basic considerations for accessibility could be explored further. But in terms of the sort of changing idea of a smaller space, more intensively used and more directly connected to neighbors, I would imagine that if you were to continue to work on this scheme, to look at each one of the units in a finer grained way, to think about things like the placement of windows and what are your views, how do you, if you're inside and it's winter, or you're inside and it's a day when you're just not up to being out in the rest of the world, how do you still stay connected? What can you see from your window, and how do you maintain some kind of a contact with your neighbors? Are there some kinds of sort of secondary transitional spaces, porches or shared entrances, or spaces where you're able to sort of be partly within your own space, but still more connected to your neighbors? I would think that would be a level of exploration that would just continue to build on the ambitions that you have for this, in terms of making it a place for a different spectrum of aging populations. I would also wonder, just two questions for you. What would be the trigger for someone having to leave this way of life, and what do these buildings not accommodate? And secondly, what would stop someone with tiny children from coming and living within this wonderful neighborhood as well? And would that make for actually a richer experience rather than this idea of only taking a particular portion of the aging and clustering them around the laneway? It does seem that the whole idea of living on a smaller footprint, living in a more dense but still quite varied configuration has a lot to offer for all of us in many stages of life. So I think that would be something that would be maybe interesting to hear you speak about as well.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question, which is about someone who maybe cannot live here. So some of the things that this proposal limits is something that a long-term care home would provide. So service like all throughout the day for people who are really not able to take care of themselves, like by themselves. So this proposal does lack that care, but the idea that the central neighborhood house is close by, so that if it does come to some sort of situation, that can provide a secondary option. But it does, it's not meant for people who do need the services required from a long-term care home. And addressing the second question about what's stopping people from, bringing their kids into this kind of development, I think so. There was a fourth module, and this module was meant to have another tenant. So if the elderly couple that was living there, if it was a singular elderly person, they could rent out like that extra room to perhaps like someone attending university or someone who just needed to use the space, or if a grandchild wanted to live with them. But because it was a 3-story module, it started to create a different language with the laneway housings at the house at the back. And also because of the limitations of the 45 angular plane from the back of the dwellings, it was hard to create a nice space with that module. But it was an interesting idea that I'd explored earlier about what would it look like if some of the generations started to mix in this development and create, a different kind of enrichment in this neighborhood, or a different type of, life that would look like around here. There actually is a school close by, which is why I referred to it in Gladys's narrative. Find a good image of it. So the central neighborhood house is like here in the middle, but there is a school actually on the other side of Berkeley Street. And that's kind of why I incorporated the idea of children into the narrative. And there was a few discussions about maybe creating some kind of smaller paths that would kind of come between some of the dwellings. However, they were already really narrow, and if I couldn't fit a gurney between some of these spaces, I didn't think it would be a good idea to kind of introduce that that path as of yet. But it is something that I had thought about. I just wasn't sure how much it would change the dynamic of who lives here and those day-to-day activities. But there isn't anything stopping, grandparents who want to have their grandkids over and, for a week or so to live in this space.
Did you look at all at sort of covering over portions of the street, or creating porches, or more intermediate spaces that allow for a more protected shared use of outdoor space?
You mean like canopies and things like that?
Canopies, porches, or any kind of communal space that is actually shared within a cluster or along one leg of the laneway?
I did think about how that would work, but then a lot of the things that had come up was the light that would enter the space. And so by creating a lot of these coverings, I was worried about reducing the natural light that comes at the back of this development, which is kind of why I tried not to pursue that route, because a lot of the thinking was, okay, so I definitely want this walkway to be here, but what is it going to look like? And the idea first was like, what if I elevate it and hide a lot of the amenities, or the water systems and electricity lines underneath. But then how does that become, if I'm elevating it, and does that mean that it's only accessible by the laneway? Like, you can't access this walkway from the existing house. Like, what if somebody needed to use that space or need that connection between the two? And I was really worried about the segregation between the existing dwelling and the new one. But I also didn't want to limit certain activities to specific groupings. So that's kind of why I left it a little general and just kept the spaces open for now. But I think that's an excellent question to ask about what to do with those spaces.
Could you just take us back to one of the renders looking down the street and talk a little bit about the architectural language and scale of the houses on either side of the shared pathway?
Okay. So from this, there was a lot of discussion about people watching actually, and how that's some activity that aging populations do enjoy. And I also actually enjoy doing that as well when I'm sitting outside. So I wanted to keep a lot of the units to have the window on the second floor, so that there was a level of privacy on the ground level. If you didn't, because the distance between the modules at the back, they range from 4 to 7 meters. And so sometimes that might be a little close for somebody walking by and looking in and seeing what you're doing. So a lot of the second story modules have openings only on the second floor, with some having a corner condition where you can open out from a kitchen space or something like that. And then the 1-story units that are completely wheelchair accessible, those obviously only have an opportunity to have an opening on the front. And so that's kind of why that looks that way. In terms of materiality, just kind of wanted to make it look as natural as possible to kind of complement the green spaces that are currently in the middle. So that's kind of why it looks that way. Another image. Show a little better.
What are we looking at here, Tejal? The solid wall in the foreground. So those are, why are there no windows on those buildings at grade?
So so in these modules, because they're really close, the concern was that because there would be windows right there, you could see someone walking by could see directly into that unit. So I wanted to keep some of those openings on the second floor so you could kind of watch down into the walkway.
So have you got some drawings maybe in plan that show the relationships between buildings and where you put windows relative to proximity? Because it is tight in many cases.
Yeah.
And that was a question that came up last time about, rooms at grade and how, did you set up some rules for yourself about, where you're allowed to have windows versus where you're not?
Yeah, so in this design, the windows I tried to place in the corner conditions if they were on the ground floor. And then anything in the middle I tried to place on the second level because here there's a little more privacy opening out to the side, whereas the 1-story modules can only open to, they only have one level. So obviously I had to keep those openings straight to the walkway.
So this drawing's got, so you don't have 7 meters between buildings or anything close. It's all much tighter than that. Yeah, but 4-meter differences, which I guess you can still have some windows opposite one another. But it's a privacy issue. I mean, it's possible, but.
I guess to that point, again, going back to this idea of looking at it as your scheme as a planner, or looking at it as an architect, and I can understand you're sort of moving back and forth between those two lenses. If you were to continue to work on the scheme further, I would suggest that the next level of drawing would be a much more a more detailed focus on the modules, but not simply just an individual module on its own as a freestanding piece, because so much of what you're drawing is about this very integrated, dense way of living. As Cheryl's saying, as when you zoom in and begin to make more particular decisions as an architect about where you place the window or how it's configured, it still is incredibly important to be looking at these in terms of the clusters and thinking about the scale of the spaces that are being developed, and to make sure that in your drawings, that kind of decision that I think you have likely made just reads much more clearly through the drawing, so that when this may be just a question of resolution of the screen at which I'm looking at your drawings, but to be able to make really clear at this scale, what is the information you're trying to convey about the way that the clusters work and are situated between the backyards of the existing houses, or the kinds of space that they create in the shared laneway. But then as you continue to move into the next level of drawing, looking at the units, to be really deliberate about having those very architectural decisions about scale and interrelationship and connection and sort of thresholds and layers of privacy and independence versus interdependence, to make those ideas read very clearly as you continue to look at your modules at an increasing level of larger scale detail and examination. The drawings read very clearly in terms of this overall sense of the way that the units are clustered and the way that you move through them. And then it just makes me want to know more about what the experience would be of each one of the units relative one to another. Super great questions to be exploring. Really, really interesting proposition in terms of trying to develop this other way, or these other ways of living within a city block. I should leave shortly. I just have one question for you, and I'm wondering if out of the course of this study, do you have any sense of how this type of laneway approach might be adapted to suit other block conditions within the city, or other less urban conditions that would be still part of the city fabric, but not quite along the same configuration as this laneway block that you're studying here?
Mm-hmm. I did think about that, and actually Cheryl mentioned certain laneway sites that do have areas where laneways were allocated for but never built. So some lots have larger backyards than others in a certain neighborhood or a certain block, and those could potentially be another opportunity to have this condition. I think inevitably, because removing the laneway itself kind of not really cancels, but just takes away the idea of it having to be on a laneway site. But I feel like as long as there is space for something like this to occur, where the density that's being proposed is healthy in a sense where there is enough of it, that it could work in a lot of other areas in Toronto. For example, a lot of this proposal is possible because of how many amenities there are within walking distance. So I wonder if spreading out a bit too far where these grocery stores and, you know, basic needs are a little further apart, then it brings up the question of, okay, how, like, transportation and how that is possible. So yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of like how this can expand, just essentially neighborhoods where there is space, but not enough space to build something much higher.
How's our time? I'm supposed to be the timekeeper, and I don't. I need to.
It's 3:07 right now.
Okay. Do you have any comments, Will? Yes.
Well, first, thank you for those comments. Those are really good, actually. Very nice comments and questions. I just had one thought, sort of building on what Michele said, that maybe one of the fourth or fifth typologies might even be some of these brown existing houses. I'm quite curious what those buildings might look like, and maybe that also begins to broach that subject of how you come to the street side instead of it being all interior looking. I mean, that's a whole nother project perhaps, but it certainly leads down that direction. I only had actually one question that I still wasn't sure about is, I know that the laneway was the beginning of this, and it's something more than the laneway. I'm kind of curious, how far are you from the laneway regulations as they are now? Are you like 110% over what's allowed, or are you like 3 miles away? Like it's just completely, you've left most of it behind, or is it almost?
Well, like wherever the laneway used to be is kind of completely gone, just because we're really massaging that the walkway in between to make sure that I could fit a lot more of these modules in them, and then only removing some if it needed to have, or trying to keep some of the existing trees, or bringing in that the fire truck access, reduced or got rid of a lot of the modules that were also proposed. But it is kind of, it's like 100, like 101%.
Is it? Okay. So you tweak like the existing laneway houses and end up here, or would you have to it'd be like a radical overhaul?
By tweaking the existing laneway houses, you would get a lot less units, or a lot less dwellings in the back. So by using the space that's like already there allocated by the property lines and the setbacks, there would just be a lot less of these units, and they would create a lot more flatter conditions along where the laneway used to be.
Great. Yeah. I could say more, but I'll stop talking.
I mean, to me, I think you've pushed it. You've pushed it pretty far in a neighborhood that's relatively tight. It's old Toronto. The lots are narrow. The backyard to backyard distance is not huge, and I think you could make something like this a lot more comfortable in other spots that exist in the city, where there's just oddball streets that and blocks that have deeper than normal widths. Like Clinton Street, for one, is an extra deep lot, and I think I mentioned mentioned some other ones to you. They exist all over Toronto just because of the aberrant conditions that have to do with maybe geography and topography, that certain blocks are deeper than others, and you could accommodate something like this probably a lot more comfortably in some of those sites. I'm a bit concerned about if you go back to the site plan, Tejal, the one we were just looking at, I think that where's my once you get this close to these adjacent houses and you're sort of making common land all around them, then they want to participate in this thing too, presumably. And then this whole green zone ends up being a kind of circulation path for everybody else. So you almost need another route, you know, so then you've got people circulating and crossing yards. So I think it would be good if you're proposing something this tight that you have to think about. So where does this guy have a barbecue without feeling like he's, you know, infringing on this person's space and vice versa? Right? So, you know, there wants to be, I think, a continuous route on both sides of these things. And then these guys then are being trespassed upon by other people. So I think you've shown it can almost work. So I think if you had more space or you made it tighter, fewer units, reconfigured them differently, you could still house quite a few people without it having to be quite this dense. Anyway, I think, and any further comments, I think we're close to the.
Well, I think that really it's about clarifying the relationship, you know, of that existing house that faces the street to what is happening in the inside where the lane is. I think that's really a piece that I would love to have you investigate a little bit more, right? Because as Cheryl was just mentioning, there's a whole series of questions, right, that can be generated by the lack of clarity between that, you know, relationship, which is obviously, you know, one that needs to be resolved in order for this to truly work.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, well, thank you, Tejal. We'll retire and deliberate and get back to you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to present all of this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for being here today.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and thank you, Sydney and Michele. It's very generous of you to show up and participate in these reviews. It means a lot.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Michele and Sydney, you'll stay for the discussion, and Tejal will see you later. Okay.